Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. And hopefully, if you've been listening to us, things are beginning to come better into focus, or come into better focus, whichever way is more appropriate. Sometimes my Cajunness shows more obviously than other times. In order to make sense of the chaos, you have to have glasses through which to see the world around you. And so I think we need to see the world through God's eyes. We need to think His thoughts after Him. And in order to do that, we have to understand what those thoughts are and how His eyes see the world. So I propose these 7 principles, these 7 facts as pillars of truth upon which we can build a view of reality. The first pillar of truth, if you will, is that God created the cosmos for His glory, not for man's glory. Second, the jewel of creation is mankind. That's in Genesis 1. By the way, the first principle is found in Isaiah 43:7. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God ordained Adam's fall. Fourth, in Adam the entire creation fell, including all of mankind. Fifth, as a result of the fall, God pronounced a curse of enmity, a perpetual curse of enmity until the end of time, between the seed of the woman, which was Jesus Christ initially, and of course later all those who would be in Him, all the elect, who would spend eternity with Him. And the other half of the enmity was the seed of the serpent, fallen Adam, Satan, the demons, and the balance of humanity. Sixth, this is known as the great antithesis. Sixth, all subsequent human social experience, that is to say all history, is an outworking of this antithesis. Seventh, the unregenerate are without excuse. The seed of the serpent has no excuse. They can't say, well, I just didn't have enough information. If I had been able to see who God was, I would have believed. God tells us through Paul in Romans 1 that He has placed His truth in them. It is clearly visible to them. He's also placed it in the creation, and everywhere they look, when they open their eyes, when they listen, when they smell, when they touch, everything they do proclaims His existence, but they deny that existence in culpable self-deceit. How can they do that? Well, I assure you, before I was a Christian, I did it as well. And I did it for 35 years, every day. And I didn't find it hard to do. Well, all right. We've been talking about the Reformation. And remember, just to set the stage a little bit here, the 2 fundamental issues that the Reformers were grappling with, and they weren't trying to establish a new church. They were trying to bring the truth back to the existing church. They regarded themselves as Catholics, and they regarded Catholicism as the one true church that had erred and needed to be corrected. So they were going to apply the corrective. Hold your nose, take this medicine. Well, the church wouldn't hold its nose and wouldn't take the medicine, which of course ended up establishing what they stood for in opposition to the truth of Scripture. But anyway, the 2 great issues that initiated the Reformation were, first of all, the question of authority. Does authority reside with God and His Word, and every man can go to His Word to see what it has to say? And of course, we should consult those who know more about the Word, can read better, understand better, reason better, all of those things. But nevertheless, the authority is in God and His Word, or is it in men? Is it in chosen men? Is it in the Roman Catholic Church? Well, obviously the church said they had that authority, and the Reformer says, no, you don't. So that was the first issue. The second issue is the doctrines of grace. As we said yesterday, all Christians are virtually all Christians agree that God's grace is necessary for salvation. The problem is not that in finding Christians that don't agree that that grace is necessary for salvation, it's in finding Christians that agree that it's sufficient for salvation, that it's all that's needed. God's grace is all that's needed. The Roman Catholics taught that faith plus works, and that's how you're saved. Arminian Christians today, Protestants, most of them, teach a form of that, though they deny that's what they're teaching. But they say, well, of course, we have to come to Christ in faith. We have to ask him to grant us faith, and then he will regenerate us and grant us more faith. Essentially, that's what they're saying, because you see, to go to Christ and ask him to grant you faith requires a measure of faith in the first place. Now, what is that? Where does that come from? If that's not a gift of God, then there's a measure of faith that's not a gift of God. And if God has given everybody that measure of faith, then of course the difference between the saved and the lost would lie with the decisions that they made. Well, if I made a good decision, you made a bad decision, why can I not boast? But Paul says, I cannot boast, for I did nothing to earn my own salvation. So anyway, today we're in Romans 9. We talked about Romans 9, 11 through 18 yesterday, and we'll pick up right there today. And the last verse, which is 9:18, says, so then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. Now, I talked yesterday about what judicial hardening means. It doesn't mean that God looks down and he sees people who earnestly desire to do good and to love him, and he says, no, I'm not going to let them do that. I'm going to turn them against me. I'm going to harden their hearts. That's not the case. The truth is, when he looks down at humanity, all he sees is a vast swamp of swamp creatures who hate him and who want to do all the possible evil in their own hearts. You say, well, I don't see that. Well, of course not, because what you're seeing when you look around you is not only the evil that people would do, but the evil inhibited by God's restraining grace. Okay? God restrains the evil that you and I would do apart from him. Why? Because Adam and Eve, when they fell, that fall meant that for them and for all subsequent human beings born, the desire to please themselves, to follow their own desires, was the highest value for them in the universe. And the only thing that limits that, before God's regenerating grace is applied to the seed of the woman, is God's restraining grace, which is applied across the board in whatever measure God intends, in order to keep people from just destroying one another. To keep the world moving at all, God has to restrain the evil that men might do. And you think, well, I wouldn't do this or I wouldn't do that. That's nonsense. If something in you rose up desiring to do whatever, and God did not restrain you, had not saved you, if you're not saved now, then if he isn't restraining you, you would go do it. And the fact that you don't like to do that is because God has restrained you from desiring that at this point. That's what you have to see. It's not that we got basically good people out there. There are no basically good people. That's a null class. Remember, Romans 1. God's wrath is directed toward the entire seed of the serpent. All of them. And they're all without excuse. Well, you don't want to believe that. Well, then don't believe it. But don't call yourself a Bible-believing Christian. That's what the Bible says. It's not me. You want to fight with me? That's pretty easy. I'm just a little old man. You can knock me down pretty easily. But behind me, if I'm speaking God's truth, I have a pretty big brother. And he'll take care of you. He always does. Anyway, for anyone raised in America outside the tradition of Calvinism, this verse I just read, that God has mercy on whomever he wills and he hardens whomever he wills, seems very baffling and offensive. justice and fairness seem completely abandoned. Can this really teach that God, before they were even born, raised up Esau to make of him an example of unrighteousness, a vessel of wrath prepared for destruction? We'll find that in verse 22, which we'll be reading in a moment. While graciously saving his brother Jacob, a vessel of mercy, that's in verse 23, without reference to anything good or bad that either had done or would do? And is it possible that a good and loving God raised up Pharaoh for the express purpose of destroying him after God himself hardened Pharaoh's heart? That must be a mistake, you're thinking. If this is true, how can God still find fault with Pharaoh? Well, yes. Isn't this how most Americans think? So, if you're thinking that, guess what? Paul was thinking that you'd be thinking that. Because he writes immediately thereafter, in verse 19, he says, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will?" Now, here's a wonderful opportunity for Paul to say, you misunderstand me. I'm not saying that God hardens Pharaoh. That's terrible. Okay? Pharaoh is free to choose to do whatever he wants to do. God's not hardening him, not making him be bad. I mean, Pharaoh wants to be bad. God's not in charge of Pharaoh's badness. Pharaoh's doing that all on his own. God's just fervently hoping that Pharaoh will do good, but Pharaoh's not doing good. This is all Pharaoh doing, none of God doing. No. But what does Paul answer? What does he actually say? He says, "But who are you, O man, to answer back to God?" In the vernacular today, that means he says, who are you to be sassing God? He says, you don't have a right to ask this question. You've overstepped your bounds. Then he says, will what is molded say to its molder, I'm molded, Esau's molded, you're molded, we're made by God. Who's our molder? God. So he says, will what is molded, the creature, say to God, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay, and that's all we are, to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? Wow. Is he really saying that? What if God, desiring to show his wrath, wrath, there we get that wrath again, huh? Yes. Sounds like what he has against the seed of the serpent, wrath. Yes, he does. Well, how does that fit in your picture of God as being a God of love? Well, if it doesn't, your picture is wrong. You need to read the Bible and find out who God really is. Because you can worship the wrong God all you want, but the wrong God saves no one. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? There you have it. There you have it. This is entirely, he says, God is sovereign. You're a creature. All of his creatures are at his command, and he has a perfect right to do with his creatures as he desires. Since all of his creatures are born hating him and desiring rebellion, then he is perfectly free to remove his restraining grace and let them rebel to their heart's content, rebel to their heart's content, or to restrain them, or even to convert them, to regenerate them, to bring them into his family. It's up to him. It's entirely up to him. okay, left to our own devices, our own will, unassisted by God, unrestrained by God, all that we'll ever do is evil continually. That's what the Bible says. And that doesn't paint a very pretty picture of humanity, does it? No. No. Why? Because we're not very pretty. Say, don't you live in this world? Aren't you constantly seeing people doing terribly evil things? Aren't you seeing right now mayors and governors ruling as little tin pot Napoleons and ordering their people to cease and desist normal, ordinary, daily activities that are guaranteed freedom to do under the Constitution which they swore to uphold? Well, yes, but they're just trying to protect us, to preserve our health. That's not their job. That's not their job. They're to protect us from evildoers who would break God's law and inflict harm upon us. They're not here to protect our health. That's our jobs. That's our families' jobs. That's our church's jobs. That is not the government's job. It has no business getting into that. Well, people will die. Hey, people are going to die. Here's a promise. Here's a guarantee. I guarantee you there are about 7 billion people living on the earth today. I absolutely guarantee you this. This is a guarantee. You can take it to the bank. This is going to happen. Okay? In the year 2170, not one of the people living on the earth today will still be alive. All 7 billion will be dead of one thing or another. Well, that's only 150 years from now. Yep. Are you so certain that no one will live longer than 150 years? Well, I'm certain enough to make the guarantee. But if you'd like, let's move it to another 50 years, 200 years from now. Do you think anyone's going to be alive in 200 years? No. All right. So how we die, when we die, really is much less important than the fact that we will die. And the government cannot prevent our deaths. We will die. Okay? And we have certain rights under God. And when they impose their agenda to so-called protect us, they're really feeding their power thirst and hunger. And it's evil. There's evil all around you. Don't you see it? That's who human beings are. Anyway, Paul had intended to deny or modify or explain away the harsh teaching his questioners might have thought he had stated. This was the perfect opportunity. If it is not true that God chooses some for salvation without reference to their merit while choosing to leave others in their sins, Paul himself, by his question, recognized this was the perfect time to deny it. You guys misunderstood me, he would have said. But he didn't say that, did he? Now, especially if the charge of unfairness leveled against God included God hardening Pharaoh's heart that he might continue in rebellion. This was the time to deny it. Yet, instead of denying, modifying, or explaining it away, Paul tells men they have no right to question God. Who are you to be sassing God? They are mere creatures, he says, and God is not answerable to them. That's the bottom line. This far and no farther in your questioning of me, says God through Paul. The only plausible inference to be drawn from Paul's response is that Paul knows that the questioner understands perfectly what Paul has said. Therefore, those who say Paul did not mean what he clearly said carry a heavy burden in denying his clear message. And there are those who say that. But how can you read this and say, well, no, Paul didn't really mean that, when he anticipated the very questions people were going to ask today and answers them, or tells them they have no right to ask the questions. But he certainly anticipates the questions. So don't tell me he doesn't know what the objections are and he didn't really mean to go there. No, he did mean to go there. And if he went there, these would be the objections that would be raised. Those were raised. He raises them himself. So certainly he's well aware of the implications of what he just said. They might more profitably, as I said earlier, simply deny that Romans 9 is really a part of the Bible. Of course, doing so opens Pandora's box, demanding any number of other passages be excised as well to sustain their blindness. Soon, they will have Thomas Jefferson's Bible with a small b, a lowercase b, not just small, lowercase, with all the offensive passages snipped out. It is wiser for men to tread lightly in presuming to challenge God's goodness. First, as John Calvin taught, it is wicked for men to presume to judge God. Duh. As we said, God is the standard of goodness. Therefore, it is meaningless nonsense for men who can have no alternative true standard of goodness to challenge his goodness in anything he does. How can you do that? Okay? What standard are you going to find to judge God by? He is the standard. Oh, I found this other standard of goodness. Now, where'd you find it? Well, I found it in my own heart or in my own mind. Okay, all right. So you're a creature of God. You have found some standard within yourself. You, derived from God, have found an independent standard other than God to judge God. Yes, that makes sense. Right. Furthermore, it is also meaningless nonsense for men who, by his goodness, God's goodness, live and move and have their being in him to challenge the very ground of their own being. Okay. This is really important. You have to understand this. The fact that you're alive, the fact that I'm alive, means that God is every moment sustaining us in our lives. If God removed his sustaining hand from any of us at any time, we would simply blip out of existence. Poof. Where's Sherman? He was here a moment ago, and he's gone. Every atom in my being is sustained by God's sovereign power. There is no other power in the world to sustain me. Jesus says all authority, that is, all authority means all power, has been given to him. Okay? It's been given to him. He has it. There's no other source of power in the world. No other. Well, what about the sun? Who made the sun? Who sustains the sun? Come on. Everything is sustained by God. Well, that seems pretty enormous. Wow. Yes. God is pretty enormous. Pretty powerful. Yes. And he sustains everything. He sustains you and me. And for us who live by his sufferance, he sustains us. He created us and sustains us. And so we're going to stand in his lap to slap his face, right? We mentioned earlier that even to say that God does not exist presumes so many truths that can only exist if God exists, that you couldn't say those things if he did not exist. There has to be meaning and purpose for your words to have meaning and purpose. Okay? To say God does not exist presupposes that the word God does not exist. All four of those words have to have their own meanings. And if I confect meanings for those four words, that's wonderful. Then I have meaning for myself. All right? Well, how do I get that meaning to somebody else? Unless there's meaning transcending both of us, out of which we draw in order to communicate. There has to be common meaning somewhere, or we would be self-enclosed little isolated bubbles of our own meaning that we could not express. Duh. God, the definer and source of all truth, tells us he is good. Where in all the cosmos shall we find another truth but his truth to challenge what he says? shall we tell him that he is wrong because we say so? Because he has offended our sense of fairness? Well, God, I don't think that's fair. Oh, I bet he's really impressed by that. Is that what we should tell our Creator when we meet him face to face on Judgment Day? Do we think he will defer to us? Frankly, I do not pretend to be that good a lawyer. Moreover, where can we stand in the cosmos independently of God to make our complaint? As I said, adding effrontery as well as insult to injury, we can only slap his face by standing in his lap. Well, you ask, what about man's free will? Doesn't he have free will? How can man be morally responsible for his actions if he doesn't have free will? Well, that's a good point. And you know what? The Bible, Calvin, and I, and all other Reformed people agree. For what it's worth, man's will is uncoerced and thus free. In response to this question, Calvin himself wrote, man will then be spoken of as having this sort of free decision, not because he has free choice equally of good and evil, but because he acts wickedly by will, not by compulsion. Well put indeed, but what purpose is served by labeling with a proud name such a slight thing? A noble freedom indeed, for a man not to be forced to serve sin, yet to be such a willing slave that his will is bound by the fetters of his own sin. I told you he was a good writer, huh? And he captures the point quite well. Okay, this is in volume 1 at page 264. And on page 265 of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, he cites Augustine's view on man's free will and its limitations, saying the free will has been so enslaved that it can have no power for righteousness. That's the bottom line. It's not that it's not free. It's that it's enslaved to sin. So in the sense of being free from external coercion or compulsion, man unquestionably has freedom to will that which he desires. However, the problem for fallen man is not that his will is unfree from coercion, but that his free will always flows away from obedience and submission to God and toward his own prideful lusts and rebellion against God because of the corrupt nature with which he is born. If you'll remember, we used an illustration of a compass. A compass always points to magnetic north. That's what it does. Now, man as a fallen creature is supposed to point, before he was fallen, man as a creature of God is supposed to point to God in willing submission. But because of the fall, his compass needle has been turned around and now points to himself, not to God. And so when he is going to what he regards as true north, it's always truly toward his own desires, never toward God's desires, because that's the direction his compass points. Well, is that his fault? Well, of course it is, because he lives in God's world, and he is aware, God tells us, on at least a sufficient level to be morally culpable that God exists, that he lives and moves and breathes in God's world, at God's sufferance, and nevertheless he suppresses that truth in culpable self-deceit. He blinds himself. There are none so blind as they who will not see. Well, that's him. He has inherited spiritual death from his father Adam. Hence, his desires are thoroughly depraved, making him unable to will the good and only able to follow his wicked desires, however freely he may do so. His will is free from external compulsion or coercion, yet he is enslaved by the necessity forced upon him by his own evil desires, making him his own jailer, as well as a prisoner to sin, while leaving him culpable for his own sins. Jesus calls the sinner a slave to sin. In the same way that no slave is free, no sinner is free. Since it is his will that is enslaved to sin, it is meaningless to speak of him being free to pursue righteousness, even though his will is certainly free from external coercion or compulsion preventing him doing so. It makes as much sense to speak of a man's being free to choose to be an elephant as it does to speak of him being free to do anything other than his own will dictates. You're going to follow your strongest desire with every decision you make your entire life. You will always do that. And if a fallen man's strongest desire is always directed against pleasing and submitting to God's will, he will never do that. Because his strongest desires are always pointing toward himself away from God. That's what a fallen man looks like. His will has been permanently turned away from God, and he is powerless to turn it back. God must change that orientation, turn it back for him to submit willingly to God. Now, he submits to God in acquiescence when he has to, when he's afraid of the consequences of failure to submit. That's true, but that's not submission. That's just acquiescence. He gets no credit for acquiescence. He just doesn't go to jail or receive any other bad consequences. But as far as working out the enmity between himself and God, it has no effect on that. At any rate, I see that we've concluded our half hour, and so we'll pick up this thought tomorrow. Pray that God bless you and keep you safe today. And remember, there are worse things than dying, and the worst of all is to be unfaithful to God. Thank you. I appreciate your kind attention, and I trust we will see you tomorrow.